Welcome to this edition of Focus, a program produced by the Department of Disaster Management. I'm your host, Fiona Alexander Smith, Information and Education Manager at the DDM. The department continues to encourage disaster risk reduction measures for all hazards. However, as we are in the hurricane season, we are placing significant emphasis on hurricane preparedness throughout the territory. So for this edition, we will focus on planning and developing in such a way that you do not predispose yourself to hazards, and we'll also look at ways to hurricane-proof your homes. Any development in the Virgin Islands must consider the territory's geographic makeup to include the hilly terrain, low-lying coastal areas, among other factors. It is also important that developers consider the hazards faced by the territory and, as much as possible, ensure that measures are put in place to mitigate or even prevent hazard impacts. With regards to the impact of hurricanes, we are all too familiar with the level of damage hurricane-force winds and heavy rain can cause to homes and properties. In fact, here are the estimated cost of the impacts from hurricanes which have affected the territory. Hurricane Hugo in 1989, $40 million. Hurricanes Louis and Marilyn in 1995, $8 million. In 1998, Hurricane Georges cost an estimated $12 million, and in 1999, Hurricane Lenny, $24 million. These experiences serve as reminders for us to not only hurricane-proof our homes, but also to develop properly and in a way that is sustainable. Here in the Virgin Islands, the Town and Country Planning Department has a fundamental role to play in the territory's sustainable development. Stay tuned for more details about proper development after this message.
I heard about storm surge on TV, but didn't really know what it was.
I even wiped us out. The sea swept away everything. All gone.
The waves were higher than the house.
The devastating force of a storm surge is awesome. Wave after wave. Tons and tons of water lashing and smashing down all before it. Storm surge. It's a hazard. Hazards. Take control. Reduce your loss. If you live alongside the seaside, sooner or later, storm surge, the big waves and high seas caused by a storm, will threaten your property. Plan for it. Build for it. Maybe don't build there at all. Find out more about storm surge and other hazards at your local disaster office.
Joining the program now is Chief Planner within the Town and Country Planning Department, Mr. Gregory Adams. Welcome to the program, Mr. Adams.
Thank you for having me.
All right, great. Explain, first of all, the role of the Town and Country Planning Department where development is concerned.
Well, in a nutshell, the Town and Country Planning's role is to facilitate the growth and the development of the territory. And what that means in practical language is that any development initiative, any development proposal that one might consider, it must be granted permission by the planning authority, which is facilitated through the Town and Country Planning Department.
Right. And with that in mind, and as the department responsible for ensuring proper land use and sustainable development, as you've mentioned in a nutshell there, what are the stipulations that guide how persons develop within the territory in certain areas?
Well, we have a number of standards, requirements, guidelines, as you may imagine, and they don't all apply to every situation. So, for example, if we have a coastal development, that will go under a different level of review and scrutiny, which may, for example, require the applicant to complete an environmental impact assessment, which would look at ways in which that particular development may impact the environment and what steps could be taken to mitigate those foreseen or expected impacts. Now, if you were looking at a smaller scale development, maybe something on the order of a single family home, which may be in the hillsides, it's a different process where it would be a lot more standard type review because it's a much smaller and quote unquote typical development, which may not have all of those extra steps of the review process to go through. But in that case, we're looking at the topography, the cut, and the potential for landslide and other hazards that may come into play. So we look at things like the setback, how far you are from the property lines, the gradient of your driveway, how tall the building is, any, those kinds of standards would be reviewed in that particular situation.
Right, and I know you mentioned looking at the cut and the slope and these other factors, and I know the Department of Disaster Management, we offer a service through providing hazard vulnerability assessments, HVAs, which are also conducted as part of the process to receive development approvals in some instances. And essentially an HVA, it guides or provides an overview of the hazards that may impact a property on a particular site.
Yes.
But this is just one aspect of the development process. Explain how does the HVA factor into the development process approval, and also what is required for persons to receive approval.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So I'll start with the HVA, and what the HVA does is it gives us information. It looks at the topography and the geology of the property, and it advises based on that study what the risk is in terms of the potential for landslides to occur on that property, which I'm sure anyone that is familiar with the territory would realize that after some significant downpours, we do get the higher propensity for certain areas to have landslides. So it's important to understand how the geology works with regards to landslides. So the HVA gives us some really good insight in that regard. It also tells us if the person is going to develop, what is the maximum slope of the excavated area that they should allow for, which has a very specific spatial requirement. So it begins to show us how much space they need to leave for the desired cut based on the design that they're looking to build on the property. So all of that information goes to the advice of the planning authority to really give them some guidance as to whether or not a proposal can or should be considered. And if it is, then what steps should be put in place to make sure that this project does not adversely impact the neighboring properties especially. So to the question as to the requirements that we have, the process requires that if you're building, and I'll use a residential development because that's probably over 90% of what we do is residential review. And you have to meet certain setbacks I mentioned earlier. Setbacks really are defined as the distance between the building and the boundary. So you have to maintain at least a 20-foot setback on the front, 20 feet in the rear as well, and then the sides vary depending on how tall the building is. I know I'm running through these numbers, but we can provide that information to persons if they would contact the department. It's a set of standards that we have. But we also look at the parking requirement. You need to have a certain amount of parking spaces. You also are required to have your septic tank and soak-away disposal for your waste on site if you're not in an area that is connected to the public sewer. So all of these items and elements really have a spatial requirement. So when we put everything together, it really tells us how much space is therefore then left for the actual building to be developed and whether or not it's being done in an appropriate way. So that's how we go on a case-by-case basis.
Right. And of course, that advice would help to mitigate against any potential impacts from hazards.
Exactly.
Do you find that persons are accepting the advice of the Town and Country Planning Department?
In most cases, I would say most cases, yes. You will have the cases where persons are very desirous of building on a property and the development that they're contemplating is a bit much for that particular site, I'll say. And when we do have to give a negative answer or ask them to scale back, I'm sure you could imagine that we'll meet some resistance in those cases. But for the most part, people are welcoming the advice that is granted to them through the department.
Right. People generally consider the BVI Physical Planning Act to be one of the most powerful pieces of legislation available. If this is in fact the case, what would you say has been the biggest success since the enactment of this act?
That's a good question. I think the biggest success would have to be the fact that we have a formal EIA process, environmental impact assessment process, to help us to deal with some of the large-scale development.
Yeah.
Prior to the act coming into force on around 2004, 2005, we didn't have a really good process to review those development. It wasn't standard. So it would allow for a certain amount of arbitrary process and even arbitrary decisions to some extent. Now that we have the act is very careful to stipulate which projects have to undergo the environmental impact assessment. And then we've developed a policy now as to how that process would be applied in a very standard way. So that persons know what to expect when they are going through that process. And it has grown to the point now where the EIA is not looked at as a nuisance anymore. It's actually viewed as a very helpful tool. So I think that is probably one of the greatest benefits that the act has brought, aside from the other things that come along with it. I think that would be the one I'd point to.
Right, that's good to hear. Of course, in my introduction, I mentioned that we are in the hurricane season. Of course, you know that as well. And I gave an indication of the damage and costs associated with hurricanes, which have impacted the territory. Now, during hurricanes, as I said, homes can sustain significant damage. And as the leader of the National Damage Assessment Team, and with your knowledge of the construction sector, what are some of the main factors on properties that contribute to the level of damage that some of these homes sustain?
I would have to say it would be drainage, or the lack of proper drainage tends to lead to the vast majority of the damage that we tend to see. Again, living on the hillside, you would tend to think that everything just runs downhill, so drainage is not a problem on the site. But depending on the way it's dealt with, you again would have landslides occurring after rainfall. And when landslides occur, they tend to change the drainage patterns very immediately. And so if you could imagine having landslides in close proximity to a house, what that could then translate into as far as drainage and water infiltrating the buildings. So I think that is one of the areas that we tend to see that causes probably the most problems. So if I were to suggest anything, it would be to really pay attention to the way the excavation is being done, so that the landslides don't in turn cause indirect flooding as a result of torrential rains.
What would you say are the biggest concerns for the Town and Country Planning Department this year, where development is concerned in the territory?
Biggest concern would be, I think, just illegal development, I would have to say, as a whole. And the reason I would say that is because when you have illegal development, it leads to development that is happening without the thought of the neighboring properties. And so you would get roads being cut in ways that are not being properly supervised. And so the resulting drainage, again, from that could have a negative impact on the adjoining or adjacent properties. You can get situations where you have development that is incompatible with the surroundings, which has its own set of problems that it brings along with it. So I think illegal development as a whole would probably be the biggest challenge that we have. And unfortunately, in many cases, that development translates into people building in wetlands or filling in ponds, which has, a myriad of other issues that it creates for the territory as a whole.
Yeah, and they're prone to hazard impacts.
Exactly,
yeah.
much more so.
Yeah, than others. So how does your department deal with that issue of illegal developments?
Yeah. We have, as you mentioned earlier, we do have a strong physical planning act. So we have a number of things that we can do, which we do. We issue compliance notices and stop notices. In most cases, that does get the attention of the offending developer, and they would bring the matters into compliance. Occasionally, we do have cases where people ignore those and continue anyway. The act does allow for us to take those such matters before the courts to get them heard and educated. We haven't, in my tenure, I haven't had to go through that process,
okay.
Thankfully. But the process is available to the development community, and I say that because the planning department is a part of the development community, to rectify those measures when they rise to that level.
Right. You would have just mentioned some of the concerns of the department, but are we designing better and building stronger now?
Yes, I would have to say yes. We
Okay.
are designing stronger and building better, but I say that with the caveat that I think the onus is still, for the most part, on the property developers to make sure that they engage. I'm trying to be careful how I choose my words here. Make sure that they engage experienced and qualified builders when they are conducting their development projects. While we have been designing better, as you can imagine, the best designs fall short if you don't have qualified persons to build them. So that's why I really want to suggest to people who may be in the middle of project planning that it's important to make sure that you associate yourself with qualified builders to make sure that the project that you've spent so much time and energy and money designing to a high standard is fully implemented to that high standard.
Right. I was actually going to ask you for your final advice on how persons can develop sustainably, but you have actually done that throughout the discussion. I'm not sure if you'd want to add anything else where that is concerned. Any other last parting words you'd want to leave with the audience?
Sure. I would always take the opportunity to invite people to engage the Town and Country Planning Department in dialogue. If you are planning a project, you don't have to wait until you submit an application to the department to engage us. You can come in as part of your pre-design or during the design phase. If there are questions as to whether what's being contemplated is appropriate or not, we'll be glad to sit down and discuss that with you or your design professional and give you guidance to make the approval process that much more streamlined. So I would just like to offer that opportunity to the general public to, take advantage of that service that the department offers.
All right. Mr. Adams, thank you so much for being a part of the program.
My pleasure.
I know the information you shared with our audience would help to reinforce the importance and the link between hazard mitigation and sustainable development.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. We'll be back after this commercial break.
A little rainfall and you come home and your house gone. Gone. I never thought this would happen to me.
Told them it could happen, but they never paid me no mind. Never.
The whole road go down the hill.
Landslides happen all the time. Sometimes little, sometimes big. Hazards. Take control. reduce your loss. You can do something about landslides. Trees and shrubs on hillsides bind earth together and help stop landslides. Preserve vegetation. Stop landslides. Find out more at your local disaster office.
Welcome back to Focus. The general theme for the program is on hazard mitigation for development and properties. Before the commercial break, the term Hazard Vulnerability Assessment, HVA, as we'll refer to them, was mentioned in discussion with the Chief Planner at the Town and Country Planning Department. Now, since this is a service offered by the DDM, it is important that I provide more details about HVAs. HVAs are conducted by the Mitigation and Planning team in the DDM to determine how susceptible an area is to natural hazards. An HVA report will therefore include information on how prone an area is to a specific hazard, the likely strength or intensity of a hazard event when it occurs, and the likelihood of or chance of such an event occurring. The report includes hazard maps for specific hazards that show the spatial distribution of the hazard on the site in question. For more details on HVAs or to make a request for an assessment of your site, visit the department's website at bviddm.com, click on the Services tab, and select Hazard Vulnerability Assessment. You can also call the department on 468-4200. That number again, 468-4200. We'll be back after this message.
The house was shaking. Then suddenly saw we hear bang, crack, and the roof had gone.
Man, I was so scared, I nearly wet myself.
Only those who have lived it can truly understand the devastating fury of a hurricane's wind.
The house across the road just get up and roll over.
Hurricane force wind. It's a hazard. Hazards. Take control. Reduce your loss. You can hurricane-proof your home. For example, make your roof more wind-resistant by using screws instead of nails in its construction. Find out more about hurricane force winds and other hazards at your local disaster office.
Welcome back to Focus. Before closing this program, I would like to leave you with some tips on how to hurricane-proof your home. Trim trees, especially those close to the house or near electrical and phone lines. This will prevent or minimize damage from broken branches. Before a hurricane makes landfall, put up window coverings, plywood or hurricane shutters. Clean roof gutters. Check your roof connections to ensure it is wind resistant. Keep your landscape free from debris, gravel and rocks. Remove patio chairs and other outside furniture which may be tossed by hurricane force winds. If you are unsure about your home's ability to withstand hurricanes and you are unable to stay with a family member or friend, then consider staying at an emergency shelter until after the hurricane has passed. The 2016 emergency shelter list is available on our website, bviddm.com, or on our Facebook page, BVI-DDM. Thanks for tuning in to this edition of Focus. I'm Fiona Alexander-Smith, Information and Education Manager at the DDM. Join me next time for another edition on CBN Television and on 90.9 FM.